More strikes have been traded between the U.S. and Iran this week as America announces a nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia and President Trump threatens a new wave of tariffs against Canadian goods. For more on this, let's bring in our Washington correspondent, Reggie Cecchini. So, Reggie, the tariff fallout continues. Tell us more about these new 50% tariffs Trump is threatening Canada with, on top of a new global levy. And how are these any different from the ones that the Supreme Court recently struck down?
Right. So, Miranda, we heard earlier in the week from senior administration officials and then from the president himself that these 50% tariffs were coming to Canada because of what they perceive to be unfair trade practices having to do with automobiles and the dairy sector, along with Canadian officials keeping booze, American booze, off of the shelves. And they feel that these 50% tariffs are necessary to remedy a wrong. Obviously, they don't go in place until August 19th, and we need to see if there's room for negotiation in there. On top of that, the administration put a 10% tariff in place on Friday morning linked to Section 301, which were investigations into the use of forced labor for goods that are imported into the United States. This impacts some 80 countries around the world. Canada is a part of this, even though in 2020 Canada introduced a forced labor import ban, with some trade experts arguing this is simply a way for the administration in the United States to keep the tariff wall up. Effectively, where Canada is right now is no different than where it was on Thursday. The expiring 10% tariffs were removed. The new 10% tariffs are on, but they do not cover anything that is protected by USMCA. So Canada is in the same position right now that it was in yesterday.
All right, it's not just a tariff war that Trump is waging, Reggie. Let's talk about the U.S.-Iran conflict. What's the latest there?
Right. So for the 13th night, we saw U.S. Central Command carry out strikes across Iran, and this has been moving far beyond just coastal sections. We've seen reports from the Kuwait border and from the border with Iraq that there have been ongoing strikes between the two countries for the last several days. The American president has threatened to go even further, suggesting that if the Houthis remain involved in this in the Red Sea and keep blockades on Saudi ports, along with attacks on vessels in the area, that not only will the Houthis be struck, but also to Iran facing a potentially further strike here. And there's a question as to whether this could go further and hit things like power plants and bridges, which we've heard the president say in the last couple of days, again with the United Nations and the Iranians claiming that this could potentially constitute a war crime. The Iranians have said this is an eye for an eye situation. The U.S. Secretary of State has said this is a head for an eye in the eyes of Donald Trump. So whatever kind of hope there was for the memorandum of understanding or any potential ceasefire, it appears to be crumbling very quickly.
Now, Reggie, Trump launched this war against Iran in part to restrict its nuclear program, but he has now struck a deal for another one in the region with Saudi Arabia. What are the concerns with this?
Right. So this is a deal that's been discussed since the Bush administration some 20 years ago. And essentially what we are to understand is that a deal was announced earlier this week by the U.S. Secretary of Energy to say that Saudi Arabia would be allowed to get a civilian nuclear program, and there could be some potential American involvement here by way of construction and technology. The announcement apparently went out before Donald Trump was ready for it to go out, and he has now kind of changed that around to suggest that if Saudi wants this program, they're going to have to enter the Abraham Accords and formalize and normalize relationships with Israel. It's not clear that Saudi Arabia is ultimately going to do that, but there is some significant concern here about what Saudi Arabia may get if they get this program going in the first place, and that could be a removal of what's known as the gold standard, where there has to be a rigorous international inspection. Dozens of countries around the world do this. The Saudis pushed back on that, and that's leading to concern here that if they are enriching uranium for a civilian nuclear program, what would be to stop them from turning it into something military grade? This is obviously something that could start an arms race in the Middle East. It's something that Israel is pushing back significantly on, and we now need to see if there's actually going to be something that starts up from this with Donald Trump having changed the terms.
All right, and before we let you go here, Reggie, I want to go back to the U.S.-Iran war because Trump has faced heavy criticism for it. Those opposed saying America is now worse off than when it began, but Republicans are really digging their heels in. Tell us more about this major defense bill that the House passed in support of the war.
Right, and this is a yearly bill, defense appropriations bill, that is passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. This time around, it was really along party lines here, a $1.5 trillion budget from the House. It may struggle in the Senate when it gets there because there are some members of the Senate who are concerned with how this money is being used to fund what could potentially become a forever war in Iran, especially with the U.S. Defense Secretary suggesting that the price tag for this is already some $40 billion and counting. This bill that passed through the House, it contains a number of Republican priorities, including allowing for military members to carry weapons when they are working. It allows for the Department of Defense to also be called the Department of War. It is a question here as to whether this is going to move out of the House, but it does show that there is overwhelming Republican support here for Donald Trump's kind of defense priorities. The question is going to be, if the war in Iran continues to linger, does that shift Republican support? And ultimately, what happens when this gets to the Senate? Because it would need Democrat support, and right now there's none.
All right, another very busy week out of Washington. Reggie, thanks so much for the updates. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is our Washington correspondent, Reggie Cecchini.